This is the second part of Module 16. So you just got done looking at some how much spending in Wisconsin maybe could help out our economy. So if we were in a little bit of a recession, what could you do? Some different things. Now let's look at that current disposable income and consumer spending. So the relationship between disposable income and consumer spending, basically what happens is that when households make more, they spend more. I mean, there's not a whole lot of rocket science there, right? The consumption function then, it shows how much an individual's consumption varies with the household's current disposable income. So when you look at how we do this, C is the consumer spending, right? A is the autonomous spending, and that means that's where you're going to start, and that's what you're spending with no disposable income whatsoever. If you just had like you had to make all your payments, and that's where you bare bones it. Like, oh, we got to make everything here. Then the rest of the equation is the marginal propensity to consume times how much you have in disposable income. So that's going to show us what your consumption function looks like. So if you look at the beginning, it starts out over here, and that's our autonomous consumption, right? Even at zero disposable income, we have to spend something here. And then from there, we add in how much we are going to spend, and that's our marginal propensity to consume times how much disposable income you have. And you can see it's upward sloping because the more money you make, the more you're going to spend, and that makes sense. If you look at this next part, this is for whole economies. So when you see capital letters there, that just means like it's the aggregate. It's showing it for in a whole economy, not just one individual. How can a shift in the aggregate consumption function happen? Well, sometimes what will happen is you have expected future disposable income changes. So maybe you're going to make more money in the future because you have a raise that you get every year, or you have a bonus that you get every year. Sometimes that happens. Now, what all of a sudden, if that bonus doesn't happen, right? Clark Griswold here, that might shift that consumption function to the left because you might have overspent, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh no, and then you end up in some problems, right? Another thing that could change your consumption function might be a change in your aggregate wealth. If the stock market did well this year, you might have more money and you're going to spend more, and that might shift the whole line to the right. If it was bad, you might shift that whole line to the left. And it might change over your own time or your own life cycle, right? Like when you are young, you probably are going to maybe not have as much money, so it might be to the left a little bit. And then as you get older, maybe your kids are grown and your house is paid off and your cars are paid off, and all of a sudden like your income is more. You've had more time to work, etc. Then you can see a shift there too. In terms of businesses spending, all right, so not the consumption portion like us, but businesses, that the business cycle, goes up and down. And basically, when you start looking at investment by businesses, some of it's planned, right? And when you think about this planned investment, what they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out, hey, what are my interest rates? What can I borrow at? And if I can borrow at a pretty low rate and my return is going to be higher, then I should borrow the money and expand my business. So really, investment spending often has to do with what you can get a loan for. And if the interest rate is really low, you don't have to worry. You're like, hey, I can now spend. And you can see in a downturn in the business cycle, then when the economy is contracting, it's really hard to get that upward swing to happen because businesses will not invest if it doesn't look like something positive is happening. So sometimes if we're on that downturn, the government can do something like lower interest rates, and then businesses start to borrow because they're like, hey, money's pretty cheap right now, and then we can pull ourselves back up in the business cycle, into a period of expansion. So when you think about that, they're really only going to businesses aren't dumb, right? They're not going to start expanding if they don't feel they can make more money at it. So they're going to take on less projects, etc. And then all of a sudden, if they can make money, they're going to be like, ooh, I am now going to add a new wing onto the factory, or I'm going to take on more projects because I know I can get money to invest at a zero rate or something like that. When you think about inventory, then you have to think, okay, what is inventory? It's that stock of goods to satisfy future sales. Now, there's always going to be some sort of inventory investment. Okay, you're always going to have some on hand. It's the unplanned inventory investment that's kind of worrisome because basically, if it's positive, right, that means sales were less than planned, like positive unplanned inventory. Okay. And that means you have like a higher inventory on hand. People didn't buy your product and you're like, ooh, that's not so good, right? If unplanned inventory is negative, then that meant you had, sales were more than planned. We have like a shortage. We have lower inventory than we expected. So we have to kind of adjust. Now, there's always gonna be some inventory that you have on hand, right? But then this unplanned, do you have extra or do you not have enough? That's the kind of stuff that we're looking at. So your actual investment spending is going to be like your unplanned inventory plus your planned inventory. That's what we're talking about. So how does that work? Well, my GDP, if you go back to that, right, is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus your net exports, right? But now I is your planned and unplanned inventory. So this measures what really is produced in an economy. So when you think about that aggregate expenditure, right? Aggregate expenditure is your GDP, but we're talking about the planned inventory in there, okay? The difference between GDP then and your aggregate expenditures is your unplanned inventory. So if your GDP is greater than your aggregate expenditure, then that means it's unplanned inventory is positive, so firms are going to have to reduce production. If GDP is less than your aggregate expenditure, then your unplanned inventory is negative and firms need to increase production. So that's sort of how that investment piece works in terms of like looking at the parts of GDP, right? We talked about consumption function. Here's the investment portion where businesses are like, should we choose to invest or not? How's our inventory looking? How are our interest rates looking? And then they make a decision. Okay, that is the end of Module 16. We'll see you later. Thanks.